Perfect. Perfect.
Excellent. Excellent. Now, one question, folks. Bear with me. This is my first webinar, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today. Is this going to be interactive, or in case anyone has questions, how will that be facilitated?
Jack, typically because right now there are just over 37 people on the call, we typically ask that they either send me and send an email through the chat, and we kind of filter it in that way due to background noises that may come in when we unmute 37 phone lines. You can have Q&A at the very end, or you can, like I said, if they want to send us the questions through the chat, which is available to them, they can also, there's an icon that looks like a hand. If they raise their hand and you want to stop and answer that question, I will unmute them for you, and they can give you the question, and then you can respond.
Excellent. Excellent. Very good. And that's important because we do have a lot of material to cover today, all of which is very relevant to each one of you. And I guess the best thing to do is, in the event any of you have questions that may or may not be related specifically with today's topic, I'd like to go ahead and give you my contact info as well in the event you would like to call me or email me with any questions related to the entire foreclosure process. My contact number is hammerdownauctions@comcast.net. And my phone number is area code 561-601-2200. Well, let's begin by asking a few questions. Why is it important to fully understand the entire foreclosure process? Obviously, the more knowledge we have, the fewer mistakes we are going to have. And why mistakes are so critical are because, number one, mistakes in the foreclosure process can actually delay your sales. And oftentimes, when we are there or before a sale is imminent, if a mistake is discovered, if you're on a monthly cycle, well, by the time the letters have already gone out for the next month's sale, it's too late. So we'd have to delay that sale for 2 months. And for those of you who have properties that are in the high 90s occupancy, you really don't want to be sitting on a unit that the tenant is not paying, and now we have to wait 2 more months. So obviously, this translates to higher receivables and then ultimately higher bad debt once the unit is vacated. A lot of you are also on bonus plans that are tied directly with receivables. So you want to make sure for your own bonus calculation that we minimize these mistakes as well, so that's not affected. Obviously, this can also create potential for litigation. You have to understand that the foreclosure process is most likely the most highly volatile area in terms of potential litigation for the self-storage company. So we want to make sure that we are following the state statutes and the House rules when it comes to this process. And finally, again, for those of you in highly occupied facilities, it could prevent you from having that unit re-rented to a tenant who can and will pay on time. So these are all valid reasons why we want to try to minimize our mistakes in this process. One of the things that we can do to avoid mistakes, and I'm going over this kind of backwards, we're starting over identifying what mistakes can cause or identifying how to avoid them, but then I'm going to go over some items that I found the most common mistakes that I've discovered out in the field over the past 28 years before we set a candidate unit for sale. We want to make sure that it's fully compliant with all the Florida statutes and all of your respective company policies as well. So we ask ourselves, when does the auction process really begin? Well, actually, we need to think of it this way. It needs to begin at move-in. And the reason for this is we have to assume that every unit will eventually go into foreclosure status. So we want to be sure that we obtain accurate and complete contact information. Obviously, this is when you have the most leverage. Oftentimes, when a tenant has rented the unit, many times they seem to fall off the face of the earth and you never can reach them again. So while they're in front of you, you want to ensure that you have accurate, current information for that tenant, good contact information. Another way to avoid mistakes is to, whenever you're beginning the process of the foreclosure process, You don't want to just look in the computer and assume what is in your program is accurate. What you want to do is you want to go back in that respective tenant's hard copy file and ensure that for example, the address that's in your rental program is the same as the last address provided by that tenant in writing. It could be from the original rental agreement or from a subsequent change of address card signed and dated from the tenant. It also could be from an email. As per the revisions that were made back in 2012, we can accept email changes from the tenant, address changes from the tenant by way of email, but the requirement is that that must be an email they provided you on the day they rented the storage unit. So you want to make sure, oftentimes, as you all know, many of you this applies to, when you're a new facility manager, you inherit everyone who came before you and all their mistakes. So one of the things we recommend as well is to systematically, even if it's 10 or 20 files a week, go through all the entire files and make sure that the information that's in the rental program coincides with the most recent information that's in that tenant file. Oftentimes you'll find that you're inheriting situations where previous managers may have taken a change of address over the phone or without the proper documentation, and those aren't really valid contact informations. So you want to make sure, especially for those foreclosed units, go in and check each respective file to make sure that it does match what the computer says. So those are ways we can avoid it. Let's go ahead and talk about the most common mistakes that we've found over the years before we sell a unit. As we review the file, we want to make sure that these are the items that we're looking for. Now, I was very surprised to find out just recently this is happening. We find that some managers are resending letters for the next scheduled sale when you are currently planning an auction for this current sale. And the justification for that, for those who do it, are just in case something happens, we can't sell the unit or it doesn't sell. Now we've already sent a letter out for the next month. Well, the problem with that is that now we have to honor that new date and time for the next subsequent sale. So you want to make sure for those tenants that you've already sent a letter to, you don't want to resend another letter with a different date and time. That's critical. That will definitely stop the sale and delay that for another month or at least. Another issue has to do with addresses. Again, back in 2012 with the revision, there are additional ways that you can legally accept a change of address from the customer. Obviously, you want to begin with the most recent address they provided when they rented the unit, which is typically on the new customer information form. If they change their address, it must be signed and dated, whether it's on one of your forms or whether it's just a letter from the tenant. It must be signed and dated. But also you can accept a change of address by email from the tenant if it's the email they provided when they rented the space. Now, a lot of you are on rental programs such as SiteLink where the tenant has the ability to go in and change their contact information through the website. If this happens, typically you will receive a bulletin from that program indicating that change of contact has been made. Be sure that you print that out so we have documentation in that respective tenant's file that he or she did change their contact information, at which point you may use that from that point on. Another very common issue we find is, again, remember the semantics that we're using when it comes to the last address provided by the tenant. Oftentimes, whenever a tenant rents the unit, the manager scans the driver's license, and that may or may not populate automatically into the customer information form. But what happens is you have to understand that oftentimes the address in the driver's license is not accurate. So basically what you want to do is you want to make sure that we don't use the driver's license information, but that we do make sure that the address the tenant provided on the new customer information form is the address that is populated in the line for the address in your rental program. That's probably the most common mistake as it relates to addresses. Related to that topic, if you ever have an address that you know for sure is actually an official address, but you have another address that you know that they're at, although you haven't received official notification, always feel free to go above and beyond. And that's in any case, with any topic. Go above and beyond and send an additional letter. That shows that you made every attempt to reach that tenant, which is what the spirit of the statute is all about. You've given this tenant every opportunity. So don't be afraid to go ahead and send additional or maybe even 3 letters if you have another unofficial address. Whatever it takes to show that you made every effort to reach that tenant. Another common mistake that we have found has to do with the format and the content of the notice of lien letters. Now, I know that for most managers, this is an upper management or a corporate scenario. However, we have found that oftentimes those components are not compliant or they're missing. And you might think some of these items are petty, for example, but keep in mind and don't forget that we live in a society where we have billboards along I-95 in Florida that say, whocanisue.com. So we want to make sure that we don't give an opportunity to any opportunistic tenant to take advantage of any mistake that we made, even if it's something that might seem as trivial as not having a conspicuous statement in the letter stating that if the unit is not paid by a certain date, it will go to auction. So I want to take a second and just go over those 5 components just so that we can make sure that we're all dealing with a compliant letter. First of all, the letter must include an itemized statement of the owner's claim, showing the sum due at the time of notice and the date when the sum became due. So you want a breakdown of charges. You don't want just one sum amount of the total amount owed. Secondly, we need to have a description, and this is another very common area that we find where there are deficiencies, in that that letter must include a brief and general description of what's being sold. Now, where this information comes from should be on the rental agreement or on the customer information form. So you want to make sure that if you don't have this, you want to incorporate a provision in your rental agreement that has the tenant indicate what he or she is storing. It can be very brief, and 9 times out of 10 it is general household goods. But oftentimes it's vehicles, it's specialty equipment that require a more specific description. So there needs to have that on the letter as well. Thirdly, a demand for payment within a specified time, not less than 14 days after the delivery of the notice. Well, delivery is the postmark date according to the definition of the U.S. Postal Service. So basically, you want to have a specific sentence that gives a demand for payment. And again, the spirit of this is, according to the Florida statutes, there must be at least 14 days from the time when the letter is postmarked until the time the next event happens, which would be the first legal advertisement. So that deadline or the demand date must expire, so to speak, before that next event can happen. And again, it's to give the tenant ample time to make payment before this process continues. So you want to make sure that that demand date is included. Number 4, a conspicuous statement that unless the claim is paid within the time stated in the notice, the personal property will be advertised for sale or other disposition and will be sold. This has to be a conspicuous statement that is typically a bold and larger font than the rest of the letter, so it actually jumps out at the reader. And then 5th and lastly, the name, street address, and phone number of the owner or self-storage agent whom the tenant may contact to respond to this notice. So those are the components that we're talking about in the notice of, typically called notice of lien letter. It has different names, but the notice that we send the tenant. The next common mistake has to do with military issues. Now, especially for those of you who manage facilities that are around military bases, this is a big issue because many of your tenants may be active members of the armed services. Again, with these revisions back in 2012, before that, the onus was on the tenant to notify the self-storage operator if he or she was a member. But effective as of 2012, when the revision happened, Now the onus falls upon the self-storage operator to determine if that tenant is in the military. So you need to make sure your rental agreement, or at least your new customer information form, does have a provision where the tenant can indicate whether he or she is indeed a member of the armed services. Another thing that we've come up with, if anyone's interested, you can contact me afterwards, after the webinar, that there is also what we call a military rider, where typically we can get additional information because, again, it goes back to that rental agreement being rented at that time. That's when you can get the most information. So if at the time of rental, if the tenant indicates that they are in the military, it would behoove you to have this military rider just to pull out of your file and have the tenant fill out that provides additional contact information as far as the unit and their military commander and the phone number and the contact information for that particular tenant. Also, for confirmation, we do have a website. It's the Department of Defense Manpower Database website, where we can confirm whether or not the tenant is indeed an active status of the military, but that requires at a minimum a birth date, which typically is on a copy of the driver's license. But most importantly, the only differential and distinguishing feature that could definitively tell whether this tenant is in the military would be to have their Social Security number. Now, I know a lot of tenants and a lot of customers, and as a consumer, I'm leery about giving my social as well. But it would really behoove you for those military tenants to obtain their social, and that way, if their unit does go in foreclosure, you can definitively determine whether or not they are active military, and then govern yourself accordingly based on your findings. Another issue that we have found, where it's pretty much an issue of omission that are not being done, has to do with UCC search. Now, to many of you, this might be a new concept, a UCC search. But basically, as you'll notice for those of you who are here today that are our clients, we create your auction schedule, and the first line of every cycle, we indicate that you would perform a UCC search. This stands for Uniform Commercial Code. It's a search that is done online. It's free. It just takes a few minutes. But what this does, this indicates, or this is a website, it's a state-sponsored website where you have the ability to go in and search for a tenant by your tenant's name to see if any other entity, person, company may have a lien on the contents your tenant is storing. Why is this important? Before I answer that, let me just make one statement that this is very important to understand. Your rental agreement and the Florida statutes indicate that the lien that you have on the contents your tenant is storing takes effect the very same time they sign the rental agreement. That is when your lien attaches. Now, when you choose to enforce that lien, traditionally in Florida, that's around 30 days. Some companies are more aggressive. They start that process earlier. Others are more lenient, and they start at day 40, 45 before that process begins. So that's really arbitrary based on your company policy and how aggressive you are toward your receivables. However, with regards to these UCC searches, you have to understand that before the unit letters are being mailed out, we want to do this search because that will determine whether or not any entity has a lien on what's being stored. If you do find a match, what you do is you simply can drill down and print out what is known as a financing statement. And this financing statement has a date on the top of it. This can get a little bit complicated. If any of you ever come across this, feel free to give us a call. We can walk you through it. But basically, what it boils down to is two things. Number one, the date on the top of that financing statement is the date that lien was filed. So by knowing when your lien attached, the date of the rental agreement, you can compare the two dates and see whose lien has priority. So if the date of the rental agreement precedes the date of the financing statement, then your lien has priority, and you can move forward with the process. You can still move forward at any rate, but if it turns out that the date of the financing statement is earlier, then their lien would actually have priority over the self-storage lien. And again, that goes back to your rental agreement. Most of you probably have a provision where the tenant indicates whether or not there are any liens on the items they're storing, as well as whether or not they own the items they are storing. I think that's pretty much a standard provision or requirement that the tenant indicates that they do own, indeed, the items they're storing. Again, it all goes back to getting all that information up front, because once it's in foreclosure, oftentimes we can't reach our tenants to get this information. And the second issue having to do with the UCC search is we also have to determine whether or not those items are actually in the storage unit. Typically, we'll find that, for example, Snap-on Tools may have financed some tools for a tenant who subsequently went and rented your storage unit and placed the tools in the storage unit. Well, what we found is that they put those tools in the storage unit, didn't pay you, but they also didn't pay the finance company. So the finance company used this state-sponsored website to list the lien that they have on these contents. So that is why on the first line of each cycle, if that's discovered, you would be required to send a letter, right, the same notice to that acknowledgement address on the financing statement to notify them of the sale as well. If this ever happens to anyone, I recommend just, if you have any questions, feel free to give us a call. We can walk you through it. But finally, the last thing to say about that topic is whenever you do this search, and typically you won't find a match, we recommend that you still print out those findings and place that in the tenant file. That's called a negative findings. This shows that you did your due diligence, you did your homework, and you printed out that findings and you put it in the tenant file. And again, that's one of the things that we look at prior to the auction and that upper management should be looking at as a prerequisite before selling that unit, that the UCC search was indeed done. And by the way, their website is floridaucc.com if anyone needs to write that down. Another common mistake and issue that we found out in the field that is oftentimes not being done is that conspicuous display of the notice in the office. Now, a lot of times, since these lien notices need to be displayed conspicuously, a lot of clients, they'll just place them on a clipboard or in a logbook at a place that can be seen from the public as they stand behind the counter. But one of the things we recommend to protect the privacy and confidentiality of your tenant is to take a black magic marker and just black out the address so all that's showing is their name, because we certainly don't want to leave that out in public. But that is a requirement. The statutes give you an option to either do that or place an actual letter on the unit itself, but in reality, that's not realistic because after 5 days, they're typically locked out, and because of the elements, that doesn't seem to work too well either. So it's best to choose to go with just a public display of those notices in the office. Let's talk for a moment about partial payment plans. I know that's a big deal with a lot of you, and I certainly advocate, even as the auctioneer company, we advocate that auctions are the last resort. Okay, oftentimes people fall off the face of the earth. They just succumb to the fact that they didn't do the math. It's too much for them. It's a financial burden. We have no choice but to move forward. But when you have a tenant, and we've all been there, we've all got the T-shirt, we have fallen on hard times, and you have a tenant where they have a situation or a circumstance that is valid, and you need to work with them. Well, and that's fine. We certainly advocate that. But if you do come up with a plan to work with the tenant and accept a partial payment, you need to make sure that this is in writing. It's something that has definitive dates and times so that the tenant just does not keep spinning their wheels and they keep staying in arrears and your receivables are being adversely affected. So you want to make sure that it's something that's realistic for them and that it's signed by them, and so that if in the event the payments default, now you can move forward with the process. So it should be on a case-by-case basis. I know that each of you have heard every story in the book as far as their grandmother dying 5 times because that's the reason they can't pay or whatever reason. But you want to make sure it's valid. There certainly are valid times where you want to work with the customer, but it all depends on that individual's circumstances. So make sure it is in writing. As far as the legality of it, this is a real common question. Technically, and maybe even your rental agreement, most likely it does say that you still can sell the unit. And legally you can, even if you accept a partial payment. Our policy is that if we see that a partial payment has been received within 30 days from the time of the scheduled sale, we typically will stop that sale. And the reason for that, it's really based on conservatism. If you're standing in front of a judge for having sold someone's unit who you took a partial payment from, well, what happens is it seems like the statutes go out the window and all of a sudden the tenant becomes the poor victim who made a good faith payment of $100 last week and we still sold their unit. So you don't ever want to find yourself in that scenario. What you'd rather do is start the process over again in the event the tenant defaults. So you want to make sure that you choose your battles carefully with those you want to extend the process, and do make sure it is in writing. Let's talk about statutory time constraints. Now, there are primarily 2 statutory time constraints that are dictated by the Florida Self-Storage Association. And I'm sorry, there's no slideshow, but if anyone would like for me to expound on any of these issues after the webinar, feel free to contact me. And I have for all these topics, I have either articles we've written or other supporting documentation that I can provide you to help explain more in detail. Because I know I'm going over a lot of material, and each material we could probably spend 30 minutes each topic we could spend a lot of time talking about. So I know these are all highlights of topics that we could really expound on in great debate and great detail. So if any of you do have any more need for any of these topics, more information, let me know and I will be sure to get that to you as well. As a matter of fact, regarding the partial payment plan, we do have samples of agreements that might be prudent for you to use as far as agreement plans or partial payment plans, or we have different ones based on the need that we can provide you, of course, at no charge. So basically, the next issue has to do with the time constraints. The first time constraint dictated by the Florida statute is there must be at least 14 days from the delivery date of the notice until the first ad can run. And the delivery date is, like I mentioned earlier, is typically the postmark date of when that letter was mailed. The second time constraint has to do with from the time the first ad ran or was published until the actual time of the auction must be at least 15 days. Now, for those of you who are our clients, as you know, we create an auction schedule for you that provides structure, and that also includes those statutory constraints within each auction cycle. So as long as you adhere to the auction schedule we provide, you can rest assured it will be legal in terms of those statutory time constraints. And many of you, as you have discovered, I try to factor in a buffer of a day or so. In the event the letters are supposed to go out today and they don't get out until tomorrow, you're still going to be fine. But like most of you do, I encourage you, in the event that you're not able to follow a specific date in the auction cycle, contact us and we will confirm whether or not we can still move forward. Or if you write these dates down, you can calculate whether you still have enough time before the next event happens in order to make sure it all fits in with your schedule. But we do try to factor those into those auction schedules for you. Another real common issue we have found has to do with the accuracy of the legal advertisements. Oftentimes, and this is a real common situation, you have different names used. For example, you'll have one name on the driver's license, and then you'll have another name they've given on the tenant information form, and then you'll have a third name by the way they signed it. So it's like, what name do I use? Well, the most important thing to keep in mind is that per statute, it's the name they provided you on the whether it's the rental agreement or whether it's the new customer information form. But what we recommend, just synonymously like the letters or with the addresses, if you have 2 or 3 different names, or if it's one name's before the other, or if they use William as their driver's license name, and they might write Bill, because a lot of times people use their nicknames. Just use both names in the letters. William Smith, a.k.a. Bill Smith. That way, it never hurts to go above and beyond, but it can hurt you to not do enough. So whether it's the number of letters you send out to different addresses, you always can never go wrong if you go above and beyond instead of not doing enough. Likewise with the names. Make sure that you incorporate all the names so there's no confusion. Even if there are 3 different names, that's fine. You want to make sure they're in not only the letters, but also the legal advertisements as well. So there's no problem in going overboard. Just you want to make sure you cover your bases. Another issue has to do with vehicles. Now, vehicles is becoming more and more prominent. I know a lot of companies, they don't have parking, but oftentimes what they find when they open up an outside 10 by 20, lo and behold, there's a vehicle in the unit. And you're like, okay, well, what do we do? Well, there are many things we do differently when it comes to vehicles, and that is because now not only are we complying with the Florida statutes, but we're also complying with the Florida DMV or any other respective state in which the vehicle is titled. So typically what the process is and how it differs from an orthodox self-storage unit, it has to do with, we'll do a lien search on that specific car in the state in which it's titled, and that determines the rightful owner. Oftentimes it's found that the tenant is not the owner. Sometimes it's found that the car is stolen. Sometimes it's found that there are lien holders on that vehicle. So based on what we find dictates the legal path we follow, but it does affect who receives a certain letter or how many letters are mailed. It also affects the verbiage in your legal advertisements. So every vehicle and vessel is a case-by-case basis. If it has a VIN number and is titleable, we must do a lien search in order to notify the proper people. And most importantly, when that unit is sold, we have to give documentation to the winning purchaser so that he or she can take it to the DMV to get the vehicle titled. If we don't do our homework correctly prior to the sale, then they're going to send that bidder back to your property and say we have a problem. So other issues that we're going to talk about in future seminar or webinars or maybe articles have to do with tenant bankruptcy situations and how to handle tenants who are deceased. Those scenarios, they are very prominent as well. Another issue I wanted to cover has to do with going back to the revision back in 2012 regarding the email. Now, this is something a lot of people have asked about. So I can now send my notice of lien letters by email. Well, there are some requirements if you choose to do that. Yes, you may do that. But what the statute states is that at the time of rental, just like at that time, that is the time that you would obtain the tenant's address, you would also obtain their email address. So as long as it's the most recent email address provided by the tenant, then you may send your notice of lien letters by email address, but there must be a mechanism in place where you can confirm the date and delivery and content of that email. Synonymously, it doesn't have to show it was read, it just has to show it was received. Specifically, the statute does say if the owner sends notice of a pending sale of property to the tenant's last known email address and does not receive a response, return receipt, or delivery confirmation from the same email address, the owner must send notice of the sale to the tenant by first-class mail with a certificate of mailing to the tenant's last known address before proceeding with the sale. So for those of you who are using email as the mechanism to send your letters, you might want to plan to do that 2 or 3 days before the deadline for the hard copy letters would have to have been mailed out. In the event you don't have a delivery confirmation, you can still have time to send out your letters, and so that the sale won't be interrupted. Okay, well, I think we're at a point where if we'd like to have some Q&A, just for clarification. I'm not sure on the time, but certainly would welcome that now.
Jack, this is Tim. I'm checking for questions now.
Okay.
Louise has her hand raised. Louise, I have unmuted your line if you'd like to ask your question. As well as
Jack, can you hear me?
No, I can hear you, but I couldn't hear the gentleman.
Yeah. Louise, go ahead with your question, please.
My question was whether we are allowed to take a photocopy of military ID.
I have heard that we are not allowed to take a photocopy of military ID. I don't know. I'm not 100% sure on that. I can find out. If you'd like to email me, I will find out definitively, but I have heard from several sources that we are not allowed to take a copy of military ID. If a tenant does come into rent a space, I would still use his or her driver's license, but you can still write down the information from their ID onto this military rider and obtain additional information as well.
Okay.
All right. And I think we have another question from Penny. Penny, I've unmuted your line if you'd like to ask your question.
I didn't get the website for the lien search. I just was wondering what that website was. I couldn't understand them.
All right. That is Florida, FLORIDA, UCC.com.
UBC?
U as an umbrella, CC.
BC, okay.
.com. And once you go to that website, Penny, you would just simply, you have to accept the terms, and then you could just perform the search. And what we recommend is that you would do last name first, comma, first name, and then conversely, go first name and last name. Do the search both ways to make sure it's comprehensive, and then finally print out that negative findings. Whenever you don't find a match, just still print out that page to show that you did do your due diligence and place it in that tenant file.
Thank you.
We have a question from Renee. Renee, I've unmuted your line if you want to proceed with your question. Okay, it seems that we have a question from Taylor.
Okay.
Taylor, your line is open if you would like to proceed with your question. Taylor, are you there? And then we have a question from Victor. And Victor, your line is open for a question as well. Victor, are you available? And Alex. Alex, if you have a question, the line is now open for you. And I think that several of the questions have been if there were visuals along with the presentation. So we may have already touched on that for them, Jack.
Okay.
So I'll turn that back over to you.
Okay, very good. Well, I think that pretty much covers all of the issues I wanted to discuss today. I wanted to make sure that everyone was apprised and aware of the most common mistakes and how they can affect you and what the things to look out for. But basically, you know, I just can't reiterate enough the importance of ensuring that we are in full compliance. Obviously, you never want to dismiss even the smallest mistake, and you want to make sure that you always go above and beyond instead of taking shortcuts to the process. This is, like I say, the most volatile area in terms of potential litigation, so you want to make sure that we do follow the law. Obviously, the law gives us recourse to bring rentability back to the self-storage unit, but we want to make sure that we do everything by the letter of the law, everything straight up, so that we can efficiently re-rent that unit to somebody who can and will pay on time. And finally, if anyone does have any follow-up questions, feel free to contact me, or if you need any other supporting documentation, a copy of the statutes, or any other issue, feel free to give us a call or contact us, and we'll certainly get the answers for you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jack, so much for presenting, and thank you, Tim and Bader, for hosting this. And thank you, everyone, for attending. Again, apologies if you had issues earlier today getting the link. I'm really sorry about that, and we will definitely look into that for the next presentation. I would also like to remind everyone that early registration for the 2015 conference and expo ends on Thursday, so we hope you'll take advantage of those great savings. And if you have any questions about the event, please feel free to contact me, and I'll be absolutely happy to help you out. Finally, the next webinar is on June 10th at 2 p.m., and it's called Changing the Terms and Conditions of Your Lease, Balancing Customer Concerns with Legal Compliance. And it's going to be presented by Scott Zucker of Wiseman, Zucker, Euster, and Morochink, PC. And this is also free to members, and registration will soon be open for that. So this concludes today's webinars. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and I hope everyone has a great week.